His breath was coming in ragged gasps now. Blood was pounding in his ears as his chest threatened to explode, and sweat poured freely from seemingly every pore in his body. There's gotta be an easier way, he thought as he stumbled to a stop, doubling over, wrenching and trying to gasp for a breath at the same time. He struggled to keep moving, to put one foot in front of the other, and not stop, not quit. It didn't matter how fast as long as he kept moving and didn't give up. That was the key. That's what his brother always said. He could almost hear Sean's voice in his ear. The key to everything is never, ever, ever giving up. Anybody can quit. Anybody can try hard. But if you give up halfway through, why bother at all? Don't quit until you're done. Drive on. No matter what. His brother's words kept ringing in his head, and he kept on putting one foot in front of the other. He saw his goal up ahead and picked up his pace. The cold air set his lungs on fire, and steam shot out of his mouth and nose with every gasp. He was trying to run full speed, but his legs wouldn't respond. It seemed as if they were made of lead. He pushed and seemed to pick up some speed. He pumped his arms furiously. His leg muscles burned with each step. Finally, he made his goal, the edge of his parking lot. He stumbled to a stop once more, raising his arms high above his head and trying to get more precious oxygen into his tortured lungs. He let his arms down slowly, repeating the process until his breathing returned almost to normal. Eric shuffled his feet and moved slowly towards his apartment. He stripped off his shoes and sodden sweats just inside the door. He padded naked through the small apartment to the bathroom and started his shower. Going back out to the kitchen, he pulled open the fridge and took out a cold beer and made his way back to the bathroom. Just as he brought the beer to his lips, he caught his reflection in the full-length mirror of the bathroom door. His first thought was he'd make a great before picture for some weight loss or muscle building program. Ah, it ain't that bad, he said out loud and turned sideways, sucked in his gut, and held his arms up in a classic muscle man pose. As his face turned red from the strain of flexing, he realized no miracles were going to happen today, and he relaxed. He held the bottle of beer up and looked at the moist, slick, dark bottle and could almost taste the bitter amber liquid inside. Then he took another look at his sagging stomach. Shit, he said out loud to his reflection. Muscle tone's all gone. No wonder Maggie tossed your ass. You look like a pig. Depressed now, he stepped into the bathroom and poured the beer down the sink. He slowly got into the hot showers. The steam started filling the tiny room. Eric forced himself to stand under the unrelenting stream until he got used to it. His mind wandered. He was proud of himself for his run. 1 mile. It didn't seem like much, but he hadn't stopped, not counting that one time he had stopped to throw up. It was a goal. Now he could set another. He could hear what his ex-wife would say. 1 mile. Big deal. Anybody can do that. What makes you think you're so special? She said that about every accomplishment he ever made. Between her and his father, they had been a cheery pair to be around indeed. His life seemed to be a succession of one thing after another, trying to find somewhere he fit in or something he fit in doing. But his ex-wife's words of loser or what are you wasting your time and our money on that for? And his father's way of looking through him, all the while putting his brother Sean on a pedestal, seemed to take the wind out of his sails. When he was feeling sorry for himself, he would blame them for his failures. If they would have just supported me, it would have been different, he'd think. But he knew that was wrong. It was nobody's fault but his own. It may have been different if they had supported him, but it always came down to one of Sean's cardinal rules. Never give up. And he always seemed to, somewhere along the way. He had forgotten how to win, and how to finish something he started. It was a vicious circle. He'd get down when something didn't go right, then Maggie and his dad would start putting him down and ridiculing him. Then he'd start feeling sorry for himself and give up. As always, Sean was right. In the end, it all came down to giving up. Sean never made fun of him. Quite the opposite. He supported Eric. That used to make Eric so mad sometimes. Everyone would be down on Eric, comparing one of his failures to one of Sean's successes, and Sean wouldn't gloat. He'd just help Eric through the rough spots, and find something he did well along the way to praise him for. That's all he wanted was a, "Good job, Eric," from the people he loved. That's why he drifted from one thing to the next, hoping to find something he did well, so they'd show him their approval. But that was no excuse. It still came down to him giving up, so he'd finally turn into the one thing he'd feared most, what they always called him, a loser. When he was being honest with himself, he figured that's one reason he started cheating on Maggie, just to prove to himself that someone found him attractive, that someone could love him. But he realized it was just another excuse, that out of habit he was forcing his marriage to fail like everything else he tried. He'd carried the chip heavy on his shoulder, and it turned bitter towards Maggie, his friends, and even his kids. He had turned into a real SOB. Eric figured his daughter summed it up pretty good when she told him, "Dad, you're such an asshole." It hurt, but she was right. He had started treating his kids with the same put-down indifference he had been treated with. That was one thing he couldn't forgive himself for. He wished he could be more like Sean. Things always seemed so easy for Sean, but he knew that wasn't true either. Sean worked hard to get where he was. It only seemed easy because Sean always succeeded. He never quit anything in his life. If he didn't do well, he'd practice until he was the best. That was the difference. Sean never quit. He always did. Sean told him over and over all he had to do to change his luck was to learn to drive on. Sean said, "You'll lose sometimes, sure, but if you keep at it, you'll succeed in the end. You only ever fail if you give up." He was trying to do that now, but God, it was hard. 1 mile, and he felt like he was gonna die. He hoped someday it would get easy. What was it Sean always said? The only easy day was yesterday. Eric took a deep breath, gritted his teeth, and turned off the hot water and turned on the cold. He forced himself to stay put and counted to 30, then shut the water off. Brrr, he shivered and grabbed a towel. He stepped out of the tub, toweling off quickly. He hurried to his room and pulled on clean sweats. That's better, he thought, as the clothes warmed him. He went back to the bathroom and brushed his hair. I should cut it, he thought, cleaning off a spot in the mirror. It's getting so thin, it just looks shitty long anymore. Eric shrugged, left the bathroom, then busied himself cleaning and straightening his apartment. Part of his new discipline, trying to keep everything in its place. Force himself to do what's necessary. Start with the little things, and work his way up. Eric smiled. Today my bedroom, tomorrow the world. Ha ha ha, he said in a sinister voice. Finishing his work, he looked around his dreary little place. I hope someday it gets better than this, he said to the walls, but he had to admit, it had been getting better since Thanksgiving when Sean had showed up. Good old Sean to save the day yet again. It felt so good just not to be mad at his brother anymore, and they had a good couple days getting drunk, talking about the good old times when they had both been happier and life had been easy. It's funny how everyone looks back at the good old days when they were younger. Now everyone thought his or her life sucked. Nobody ever looks ahead to things being good, although his brother probably did. Yeah, things were improving. Sean had come home, and he had scored the biggest buck of his life. Eric took that as a sign of better things to come. He wasn't quite sure why, but he knew he was due. Things were looking up for his brother too, as usual. His new job sounded great. It might be tough, but they were sending Sean all over the country to learn lots of cool things, and paying him big money too. Eric hoped that Sean could come home for Christmas, but he had been out on the West Coast. They had been talking at least once a week, and Eric was going to see him when Easter came, or he got laid off when they closed the truck plant. Eric looked around, satisfied with his work. He flipped on the stereo and listened as some new one-hit wonder band rehashed the same old driving rock and roll rhythms. It was sad. So many of the new bands tried to redefine the genre, but they just came off as pale imitations of the bands of 20 years ago. Eric shook his head sadly. It's all been downhill since Van Halen split, he told the stereo, then sat down to check out the movies. He liked going to the movies. For 2 hours he could just lose himself, and not think about things that had him down. He could step away from his life, from his mistakes, and his boring nowhere job. No wonder movies were such big business. Booze too, for that matter. Everybody trying to escape. Eric thought about his job and the people he worked with. Good people, like he had told Sean when he thought his brother was putting him down. They worked hard to support their families, and the valley. WWM was the last big industry left in the area that had once thrived on the steel and automotive business. The Mahoning Valley, solid blue-collar America. Hard times had come here. With the mills closing, Worldwide Motors was the last big paycheck to be had, and the people who worked there knew it. They knew how lucky they were to even have a job right now, the way the economy was. But to a man, deep down in, they all hated it. They all yearned for a different life, something more. Not all would want a life as exotic or as dangerous as Sean's, but the long hours and monotonous work took its toll. Most just wanted a career away from the restricting confines of the factory where you couldn't tell if it was night or day, spring or fall. You could tell when it was summer because it was often 110 degrees or above, but it was always the same. There were better ways to spend your life than being tied to an assembly line 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. Sean said they had looked like something out of Night of the Living Dead. Eric had taken offense, but he had been looking around lately, and he had to agree with his brother. It was a safe way to make a good middle-class living, and it took time to take its toll on you. Most people still hadn't noticed it had made them old at a very young age. It seemed to take away your balls, in a manner of speaking. Eric thought everybody he knew wanted to leave, but, like him, they were all afraid. Afraid they couldn't cut it in the real world without a skill. Or were they all afraid to try? No balls, he thought, meaning himself. Eric studied the theater ads closely, noting the times. The latest action-adventure offering looked good, and there was a comedy he had heard good things about too. Eric figured he could use a laugh. He shrugged and thought to himself, I got plenty of time. I'll decide when I get there. Eric got up off the couch, stretching his sore muscles. He had to admit the ache felt pretty good. He changed quickly into a t-shirt and a pair of jeans, noting with satisfaction that they were losing their snugness. I guess I am looking slimmer, he thought. His mind flashed back to his earlier naked image, but I still got a long way to go. Satisfied, he grabbed his coat on the way out the door and headed off. An hour later found Eric seated alone in a small theater, one of 10 in the Cineplex. Arranging his large Diet Cola, tub of buttered popcorn, and 2 boxes of chocolate-covered almonds. After all, he rationalized, he had run a mile today, and this was his reward. The theater filled quickly. As the lights dimmed, Eric plopped a few fluffy kernels of buttery popcorn into his mouth and sunk into his movie mindset, forgetting his troubles, and blending himself in with the movie's hero, casting away his fears and the chains that held him to his depressing hum-ho life. A little over 2 hours later, Eric left the theater caught in a wave of humanity that spilled from the building, as all 10 theaters in the Cineplex seemed to end their features at once. Eric ambled along, not rushed or in a hurry. He had nowhere to be, and he strolled along easily, a contented smile on his face. The movie was even better than billed, and Eric was trying to hold on to that fleeting high he felt. As he drove home, the movie's excitement wore off, and Eric felt his troubles weighing on him again. He replayed the film's highlights in his mind, and thought about what he'd do if it were him, trying to rekindle that feeling of excitement and euphoria. He fell into comparing the film's hero to Sean. They were a lot alike, and he realized, maybe for the first time, that if he was honest with himself, his brother was his real-life hero. That was bad, he thought. Nah, if he was going to have a hero, he couldn't think of anyone better. He was going to impress Sean when they got together at Easter. His goal was to lose 10 pounds and run up to 3 miles a day by then. He had almost 2 months. This time, he wasn't going to quit. 1865. The bitter smell of gun smoke and the sounds of screams filled the air as the rebel horsemen attacked again. Virgil drew his pistol and wheeled his horse around, trying in vain to get one of the rebels in his sights. They seemed to be everywhere amongst his men. Virgil watched in anger as 2 more of his men toppled from their mounts. Then he looked up just in time to see a large rebel with wild eyes bearing down on him. He saw the sneer fixed on the man's face and stared at the gaping bore of his pistol. Virgil flinched involuntarily as the rebel pulled the trigger. For an instant, time seemed to stand still. Nothing happened. Both men stared at each other, realizing in the same instant that the pistol misfired. The big rebel pulled the trigger again and again, to no avail, then desperately pawed at another pistol he had hanging from a saddle holster. It was a race now. Who could bring their gun to bear first? Already having his pistol free, Virgil easily won, bringing his Colt up and shooting the larger man in the face. The bullet took the rebel under the left eye and knocked him backwards out of his saddle. Virgil smiled wickedly as he saw another rebel fall. Then he quickly looked around for his brother Eli. Fear gripped him as he spotted Eli on the ground through the smoky haze. One of the rebel riders bearing down on him, trying to trample him. When the rebels first attacked, Eli had been grazed on the side of the head with a pistol ball. He reeled drunkenly in the saddle, dazed by the blow. He was disoriented, and as he tried to wipe the blood from his eyes, his horse reared, and he fell to the ground, knocking the wind out of him. He lay there, not knowing how long, while the battle raged around him. As his breath returned, he got unsteadily to his feet, wiping the blood from his eyes so he could see. He felt the wound and knew it was just a graze, but there was a lot of blood, and his head pounded fiercely. He heard the pounding of horses' hooves, and blinked his eyes into focus, diving out of the way an instant before one of the rebels rode him down. Then, everything went black. Eli fought the blackness. He opened his eyes and tried to lift his head. He saw Virgil standing over him, shooting at the retreating rebels. He tried to call his name, to tell them to leave him be and get after their gold, but nothing seemed to work. His head grew heavier, and the blackness closed slowly around him until he dropped his head, and it overtook him completely. Virgil stood protectively over his brother. Even though he knew the horsemen were out of range, he vented his rage by emptying his pistol at them. When the hammer clicked twice on empty cylinders, he holstered his weapon, and fearing the worst, knelt over Eli to check his condition. "Dear God," Virgil said out loud as he saw his brother's breathing falter, then stop. He checked his wound, seeing it was just a graze, but he had seen wounds like this kill before. From the shock to the brain, a Sawbones had once told him. Virgil took a deep breath and paused to collect his thoughts. It had all seemed so simple when Eli explained it in the stable that night. Now the dream had turned into a nightmare. Over half his men dead, the gold gone, and his brother lost, too. He needed time to think, but there was much to tend to. "Sergeant!" he yelled loudly, not looking up from his brother's form. "Sir," came the curt reply. "Sergeant, see to the wounded men, and the dead. Check the rebels dead, and see if you find anything of note." "Yes, sir," the sergeant answered in the same curt voice, and at once started barking orders, organizing the men. John Perrier watched from the top of a nearby hill, while Charlie McDough, Nick Carter, and Lewis Powell looked on further down the hill. After a short while, Perrier ambled down the hill, taking his time. When he got closer, McDough tried to hurry him along, urging him, "Come on, John." "Ain't no need, Charlie. You was right. They ain't chasing us no more. They picking up and tended to the wounded." "Oh, they'll be along all right," Nick Carter added. "Just not as fast," Charlie finished. "Their horses gotta be plumb tuckered like ours, but they come along when they find that golden bear saddlebag. Y'all can bet on that." Lewis Powell asked the question they had all been thinking. "You think they'll keep after us, or you think they figure on what we was about?" Charlie thought for a moment, then said slowly, "Don't really matter what they do now, as long as they lay up for a spell. We done what we set out to do. We bought the others some time, and we whittled down their numbers a bit. There ain't nothing but a dozen left that can ride, so they can't split up and run us and the wagon both down. And if we keep on moving but slow enough to rest the horses, and don't dilly-dally too much when we break, then we'll have a big enough lead on 'em that they won't catch us where we're going anyways." They all nodded in agreement, and Nick Carter broke into a big grin. "You forgot something, Charles." "Yeah, what's that, Nick?" McDough asked, his eyes fixed on Nick Carter's grinning face. "We at least got some of that gold, no matter what, and we had fun killing those Yankee scum." Charlie McDough smiled a wicked grin as he shook his head slowly. "You sure do hate them Yankees, don't you, Nick?" Charlie asked. I surely do, Charles. I surely do, Nick Carter replied. This shit's all well and good, Lewis Powell said, disgust rising in his voice. But in case y'all ain't noticed, they've had a pretty good run killing off some of us too. There may only be a dozen of them left, but there's only 4 of us by my last count. What do we do if they don't lie down and lick their wounds and come after us right now? Anger flashed in Charlie McDow's eyes, and his grin was replaced by an evil sneer. Didn't we have this talk earlier, pal? Charles, leave it be, Nick Carter interrupted. Then looking at Lewis Powell, he said in the quiet, menacing voice, If they come after us, Lewis, we'll give 'em hell, or we'll die trying. Then he turned his horse, and he and McDowell headed east at a slow pace. Lewis Powell sat there brooding as John Perrier mounted his horse and started after Carter and McDowell. Y'all coming, Lewis? He questioned as he started off. Powell sat there a minute longer, then followed slowly, answering Perrier under his breath. For now, John, for now, but not much longer. Nick Carter led them through the rolling hills between Chester's Gap and Front Royal, across the southern branch of the Shenandoah River, to an estate of a family friend that sat in the foothills near Manassas Gap, looking down towards Front Royal to the west. We will be welcome there, Nick Carter had said. Compton hates Yankees almost as much as we do. Lost 2 boys in Manassas and 1 at Chancellorsville, and he sets a fine table, if memory serves me correctly. He will give us safe lodging and any knowledge of any recent Yankee movement in Front Royal or through Manassas Gap. Good, Charles McDowell had said. The horses are spent from carrying the extra load. We'll rest the horses, give 'em a good meal, and head through the gap come midnight. It was a sound idea, and they all nodded their agreement, even morose Lewis Powell. They were all received and put up in the main house by Rufus Compton, the old friend of Nick Carter's father and uncle. They tended to their own horses, not wanting anyone, friend or not, to stumble on their booty. They decided after dinner that one of them would stand watch over the gold and keep an eye on the road to Front Royal and into Manassas Gap. They tossed lots for first watch. Nick Carter lost and would stand first watch, followed by Charlie McDowell, then Lewis Powell, and then John Perrier. They would eat and get some sleep, leaving after moonrise, about 1 a.m. With that settled, they went out to the main house and dined with their host on a tangy Venetian stew and biscuits. Compton, a large jolly man with rosy cheeks and a thick shock of unruly white hair, was a gracious host and eager for news from Richmond. His eyes and expression turned bitter whenever the Union or Yankees came up into their conversation. After their meal, Compton produced a jug and wanted to continue their talk around a large fieldstone fireplace in his parlor. The men reluctantly begged off, citing the need to stand watch and rest after nearly 2 straight days in the saddle. John Perrier awoke with a start. He listened intently for a few moments, trying to identify what woke him. It was probably a combination of things. Sleeping in the comfort of a real honest God-feathered mattress, or Charlie snoring across the hall. God, could that boy snore, he thought. Only when sleeping easy, though. John had never heard of Charlie doing it on a raid. The colonel wouldn't have it. He'd sooner shoot the man first. On mission, Charlie was always first rate, a real tough fighter, crack shot, and smart as a whip. He planned this here mission pretty good. They had lost some fellas, but there was a lot at stake. It was a lot to be expected, and like Charlie and Nick had said, they all knew what they were getting into. They had volunteered and could pull out or hang in there. He knew he'd stand by Charlie and Nick any day. John knew it must be getting close to his watch, so he eased quietly out of bed, dressed, gathered his things, and tiptoed into the hallway and down the steps, carrying his gear and his boots. No sense in waking the others too early. At the door, he fumbled with his well-worn cavalry boots and silently slipped out of the door. He made a stop to the privy to relieve his full bladder and headed on towards the old slave quarters where they hid their horses. Sheridan's men had burned all the barns in the valley the summer before, trying to flush Mosby's guerrillas. The night was cold and clear, not a breeze blowing, so the cold was bearable, with a million stars hanging so close you could almost touch them. He heard the horses snicker, and Lewis soothed them as he approached. Seeing the faint glow of a lantern, he became guarded. Drawing one of his pistols,
He silently stepped through the door and watched as Lewis Powell soothed the nervous horses as he finished saddling 2 of them. John Perrier stood silently for a moment, with a questioning look on his face. Sensing his presence, Lewis Powell spun quickly, drawing his own Colt. Acting on reflex, John Perrier raised his gun as Lewis Powell swung around. Both men stopped an instant from pulling the trigger. "What?" Lewis said, letting out his breath as a nervous smile crossed his face. "John, don't go sneaking up on a man that way. I almost shot you dead." Lewis lowered his gun, but John still had a questioning look on his face. "What you doing, Lewis?" he asked, lowering his gun to a more polite level. Lewis Powell holstered his gun and made busy by checking the horse's traps like he didn't hear the question for a few moments. Then he slowly looked up and met John Perrier's gaze. He looked hard at Perrier, as if debating telling his plans. "I'm leaving, John," he said slowly, as if gauging the effects the words would have on Perrier. Perrier nodded slowly, as if that was the answer he expected. "What am I supposed to tell Charlie and Nick? Are you going to kill me before you ride off?" Powell looked around disgustedly. "Hell no, I ain't going to kill you, you crazy fool. I just had enough. I'm getting out," Powell admitted, looking John in the eye. "That ain't gonna be enough for Charlie and Nick. Not now, anyhow." Powell turned back to the horses and made his final checks, securing his load. "Hell, John, I don't care what you tell him. You outrank both of them. Tell him you ordered me to split up and head up further and cross over Paris Mountain and Ashby's Gap, so it will be harder to follow, and I'll meet up with y'alls in Blackwell's." "Sounds like a good idea, only you ain't gonna be at Blackwell's, are ya?" Perrier asked, knowing the answer. "I don't know, Lewis," Perrier continued, without waiting for an answer. "This here's Charlie's raid. We all agreed beforehand." I know, Powell said, desperation creaking into his voice. "But you're an officer. For Christ's sakes, the raid's gone bad. More than half of us are dead. Who can blame you for pulling rank? Or the Colonel or Richards? I don't think so. Hell, you know well as any man, Colonel Mosby likes a man can think on his feet in a tough spot. He'll more than likely promote you." "I don't know," Perrier said, sounding confused, but not lowering his gun either. "Lewis, you know the Colonel Mosby only made me a lieutenant 'cause I'm such a good fighter, and I listen good. He done told me don't never give no man an order. Just keep on fighting like the devil and lead by example. He said I'm brave enough, but I lack judgment." Powell could see the pain of the put-down in Perrier's eyes, but he could hear the respect for Colonel Mosby in his voice. "Then you got a tough decision to make, John. I'm going on like I said. I'm taking one of the extra horses for my gear, and the gold I'll be taking. You can count what's left. I only took what I've been hauling all day. It's just enough to make it look like a horse is carrying a rider." "Lewis, don't," Perrier said, his voice getting a hard edge as he pulled back the hammer of his Colt. Lewis Powell looked John Perrier in the eye. "You gonna shoot me, John? We done rid together for a long while now. You know I ain't no coward. I charged with Pickett at Gettysburg. I ain't afraid of no Yankees. What I am sick and tired of is taking orders from 2 high-handed bastards. I don't trust them. This here raid has gone bad, and all they want to do is keep killing. They don't care if we get away or not, as long as they get another Yankee a kill or 2. We done lost the war, John. Everybody knows it. I mean, I believe in the cause as much as any man, but I don't much like wasting my time. This here gold will give me a new start, but all this killing just for killing don't make sense when we got this gold. I mean, I could see killing old Abe as somebody that might make a difference, but all this senseless shit, I done had enough." "And what do you think's gonna happen when Major Richards or Colonel Mosby gets wind of this? And don't think they won't, with all the boys we lost. If in the wagon makes it back with all that gold, Mosby, like it or not, will send it on to Richmond to further the cause, and just let us keep our share like we already got. Or he's gonna be mighty put out that we went off on our own and got so many boys killed and hanged a lot of us." He shook his head slowly. "And no, sir, not me. And you of all people, John, it wasn't that long ago the Yankees almost strung you up. Don't that eat at ya? I don't mind dying in a fight or some such, but I ain't gonna hang. I was there when they got Albert Willis and strung him up. There was too many Yankees to stop him, but we were close enough to see. Seemed real good, and no thank you. I'm taking this here share I already got, and I'm cutting out. If you're smart, John, y'all won't be far behind me. Mark my words, Charlie McDowell and Nick Carter are gonna come to a bad end. So will you if you stay with them, John. I'm cutting out. With that, Lewis Powell turned his back on John Perrier and started leading the horses away. Lewis, I'll shoot you, John Perrier said, raising his pistol higher and taking aim between Powell's shoulder blades. Lewis stopped. Without turning around, he said, No, you won't, John. You had a hard time of it shooting that bastard Cole that tried to hang you. You're too much of a man to shoot me in the back. He paused a moment longer and resumed walking. Lewis? Yeah, John? I ain't never heard you say so much at one time in all the time I known you, Perrier said, lowering his pistol and uncocking it, letting the hammer down easy. I reckon I ain't never had that much to say before, John, Powell said, and walked out into the night. John Perrier stood in silence until he heard Lewis Powell mount his horse and heard the hoofbeats recede into the night. See you in hell, Lewis, he said in a whisper as he doused the lantern. He stood there standing watch, thinking about what Lewis had said.